To say welcome to all to this final panel and the culmination of what I believe has been a fantastic conference. So I thank you all for being here on this beautiful Saturday. I'm Jennifer Hillman. I'm a professor from practice at Georgetown Law, where I've been for the past 5 years, teaching trade law, among other things, but coming myself from a background in public service in both the U.S. government and here at the WTO. It's my job for this last panel to try to do a few things. First, we are hoping to give you a small sneak peek into an upcoming edition of the Journal of International Economic Law, which, as many of you know, is the preeminent journal focused on the intersection between economics and law in the international arena. And Georgetown Law has been the proud host of this journal for many years, starting with its leadership under former Professor John Jackson. Later this year, the journal is going to publish a special edition devoted entirely to taking stock of all aspects of the current trade war and possible explanations for what caused it, and more importantly, for possible solutions to it. So this morning, we are going to be showcasing 4 out of a whole series of papers that are going to be coming out in this special edition of the Journal of International Economic Law. So we're doing this for 2 reasons. Part, it's to pique your interest. You will all want to get your hands on a copy of this Journal of International Economic Law special edition. But more importantly, it is our hope that with all of the great brains that are assembled here in this room, that these 4 authors can get a little bit of feedback, a little bit of constructive criticism, a little bit of suggestions as they work to prepare the final paper that will be submitted to the journal in August for publication. So it is our hope that we can use this as a little bit of a collective brainstorming session to assist these authors that have come forward. Second, we wanted to close out this conference with some big new ideas about where we are right now, what's the best path forward, really drawing together much of what we've heard over the past day and a half. And it's clear we are in a place that few of us have ever seen, with the U.S. imposing unilateral tariffs on steel and aluminum in the name of national security, with 6 countries responding with retaliatory tariffs of their own, most invoking the WTO Safeguards Agreement as justification for those, tariffs followed by further U.S. unilateral tariffs on China, now covering $250 billion in trade, and these in response to U.S. allegations of Chinese theft of intellectual property and forced technology transfers, and again retaliatory tariffs by China. All of these actions and retaliatory actions are now the subject of pending WTO disputes. Added to the China-U.S. trade dispute is the recent action by the United States to ban Huawei from participation in the U.S. market, which takes the trade dispute to a whole new and different level. And on top of that, we've seen the recent threat by the United States to impose further unilateral tariffs on Mexico unless Mexico does more to stop illegal immigration into the United States and buys more U.S. agriculture. On that front, I am happy to report a tweet from President Trump, and I will say that is a very rare occasion for me to happily comment on any tweet of President Trump's, but an agreement has been reached between the United States and Mexico such that these tariffs will be indefinitely suspended, is the words there. So the picture on the trade war, if we are to call it that, is quite a messy one, with lots of speculation on whether the U.S. is simply trying to build a tariff wall around itself, whether these tariffs are all a means to a more open trading system and a catalyst for change, along with further speculation of how the trading system will view the rise of China. So to answer all of these questions, we really have assembled a fantastic panel. Simon Evanet oversees the Masters of Business Administration program at the University of St. Gallen and is known to many in this room as the creator of the Global Trade Alert an independent monitor of trade protectionism and commercial policy choices being made by governments around the world. Julia Chin on this side, a professor from Wayne State University teaching international business, international finance, trade, and Chinese law. She's taught in Beijing, practiced law in Hong Kong and New York. To my immediate right, Andrew Lang is on the faculty at the Edinburgh School of Law as the chair in international law and global governance, after a long stint as a professor at the London School of Economics, and then Anne van Aken, who is the Alexander van Humboldt Professor of Law and Economics at the University of Hamburg, and has long been deeply engaged in the study of both economics and law, having previously been at the University of St. Gallen and at two arms of the Max Planck Institute. And then we are particularly delighted to joining our panel to have Alan Wolf, who is the Deputy Director General of the WTO, after a long and distinguished career in the United States, both in private practice and service in prominent positions with the U.S. government, focusing on international trade. So again, I think we're in for a real treat in terms of hearing about the work that these scholars have done, and then again, trying to pull it all together in terms of where it may take us. So let me start with the notion that the current state of affairs has raised lots of questions about why is this happening and why now? Whether the international economic order set in the 1940s and updated with the creation of the WTO just didn't work, or whether something in the political and economic landscape has fundamentally changed, requiring adjustments or even wholesale changes to the WTO and the international economic order. So I'm going to start with Simon. You've studied the history of trade and trade protectionism over many years and have written a really fascinating paper comparing today to the Smoot-Hawley days of the 1930s. So Simon, how do you see it? I mean, how do the current set of trade wars compare to similar periods in history? And what do such changes tell us about whether we are at or near a major inflection point in terms of trade policy?
Thank you, Jennifer, for introducing me. I'm going to talk about the scale of the US-China trade war, if that's the right phrase for it. Inevitably, I will use more numbers. I'll provide a quantitative assessment. I know many of you in the audience are interested in the qualitative issues. I do not mean to dismiss or demean any of that, but I do want to put some numbers on the table. I'm going to make 4 points. The first substantive point is that I'm going to compare this current trade war to the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Now, there is something of a fixation amongst trade policy analysts with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And it's not entirely clear to me that this is actually the best reference point, even though it is the one that I will use. We are, of course, comparing a bilateral trade war now with a unilateral act by a government back in the 1930s. We're also looking at using as a benchmark a unilateral act, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which in fact, according to economic historians, only triggered major retaliation from one of the United States' trading partners, Canada. If you actually read the histories, the leading mainstream histories, they actually point to the 1930s trade policy cooperation breakdown as being triggered by the British devaluation of the pound following its exit from the gold standard in 1931. So, ironically, we use this benchmark all the time about the Smoot-Hawley tariff, yet the historians tell us that that wasn't the trigger for the 1930s trade policy disaster, as Douglas Irwin calls it. Nevertheless, I will proceed on since everyone seems to fixate about Smoot-Hawley. My second comment is to do with the scale of this current war compared to Smoot-Hawley. The Smoot-Hawley tariff covered a third of US imports. The current trade war it covers 10.4% of US imports from China. If US tariffs on all Chinese imports, if US tariffs are imposed on all Chinese imports, that 10.4% becomes 22%. Still less than what we had under Smoot-Hawley. The average tariff increase that one sees across the board, for the average import into the United States under Smoot-Hawley was 2.3%. Now it is 2.6%, so there's slightly more there. In terms of welfare effects, the leading sort of studies on welfare effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff say that it cost the US's welfare about between 0.1 and 0.4%. The latest academic studies that I've seen, the two big prominent ones, the maximum loss to the United States' welfare from the tariff increases in 2018 was 0.09%. Okay? When an economist tells you a number is that small, it doesn't mean that the trade war is insignificant. What it tells you is that it's redistributing welfare or income from groups. So this is trade policy, and I think this is the first lesson, Jennifer. We are still in a world where trade policy is being used by the United States government as a redistributive tool. Okay? So that's the end of my second comment. My third comment has to do with comparing the current trade war with the developments since the financial crisis began. The history of the Smoot-Hawley tariff tells you to always look back and see what was the context. Well, what was the context for the 2018 trade war? The image you're often given in the news is that everything was going well, and then we have this trade war with tariff increases rising sharply in 2018. But was everything going well up until 2018? The answer is no. If you look carefully at US-Chinese bilateral trade, in 2017, 2/3 of US exports to China faced some type of trade distortion in the Chinese market. And if you look at Chinese exports to the United States, 2/3 of Chinese exports faced some type of trade distortion, which was in place. So there was a stock of trade distortions already there, and the trade war has added somewhat to it. This changes, I think, how we look at this trade war. The other important point to bear in mind is that other trade distortions are being implemented every single year, which go beyond the trade war. So in 2018, the amount of trade around the world which faced a tariff increase was 5 times the amount of trade involved in the trade war between the US and China. The amount of trade around the world which faced a distortion to imports, so that could come from a subsidy to import competing firms, the amount of trade involved in facing import distortions which were implemented in 2018 is 8 times the size of the trade war. And if you look at the amount of trade which has benefited from state-provided export incentives in 2018, that's 13 times the size of the current trade war. Seen in this light, then, the trade war may be important, but it is probably a drop in the ocean. Okay? So what do I conclude from this is that although we have given a lot of attention to this trade war, there has been a systematic erosion of trading conditions from 2008 onwards, and in that sense, the rot, and here is a conclusion, the rot started well before 2018. 2018 made, I think, transparent what has been going on before. Or if you want another metaphor, the tip of the iceberg became apparent in 2018. The iceberg had been there for some time. Last comments then, what do we make of this? The trade war has sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room in discussions. There's a tendency either to blame Beijing or Washington. They indeed do need to come to some type of agreement. However, that would be to ignore the fact that there are many other trade distortions being implemented by governments who claim to be good WTO members, and they need to be brought into the discussion as well. So as I said, the rot did not start in 2018, and it is not confined to one bilateral relationship. It is much broader. So seen in this light, the current trade war, I'm afraid, follows a history of post-crisis intervention and discrimination, which needs to be addressed. And I hope that the discussions here in the House focus not just on how to fix this conflict between China and the United States, if indeed that's possible, but also to start addressing some of the key trade distortions which are present in the global economy. And according to the data that my team has collected over time, most of those are related to subsidies to import competing firms or state-provided incentives to exporters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to now turn to the work that Anne has done, because I think Simon has given us a good context for the sort of history and where we should situate this trade war, if that's what we're going to call it, in a historical context. Anne, I think's work speaks very well to the issue of why is this happening, at least in terms of what may be driving citizens, politicians and institutions in their reaction to this change. And for Anne, I mean, the question really is, has the political economy of trade liberalization and protectionism changed recently? How can trade policy makers consider these factors in shaping a better, more inclusive, or more resilient trading system? So, Anne, I'm going to give you a minute to move the slides. And then ask you to go ahead and give us a sense of why. What's driving this?
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I try to be very quick. First, this is joint work with Jürgen Kurz from EUI Melbourne, who's sitting right here, so he might come up and correct me in what I'm saying. What motivated us was really trying to understand what's going on now. And as you all know, and I'm not going to explain that, but our institutions are basically, and the theory, trade theory is basically based on the political economy of trade. So we need to understand internal processes in order to understand the trade policy of states, and we assume rational citizens, rational voters, rational politicians, rational lobbyists. And we also assume that they have material self-interest preferences. And we question whether this rational choice model is sufficient in explaining the contemporary formation of trade policy. So basically, interestingly, Grossman-Helpman, like the doyens of the political economy story of trade, had a paper in 2018 on identity preferences. So what they do, obviously they feel we are unable to understand what's going on, but there might be an identity issue here, and their hypothesis would be that voters' preferences over trade policy reflect not only their material self-interest, but also concerns for members of those groups in society with whom they identify, an in-group, and the in-group is basically non-elitist. Okay, so anything which goes against the elite is good. And they basically find that that augments the demand for protectionist policies. Now, there has been some work from the behavioral economic perspective on trade policy, early on TOVA from the World Bank, 2009, basically on loss aversion and trying to explain why we give subsidies to declining industries, where every economist would tell you not to do so. And there's some other research, but it's rather scattered. So what we try to do is basically draw on behavioral economics and cognitive psychology, which has been well researched. There has been an economic Nobel Prize for this, actually for a psychologist, Kahneman, and it's widely used in economics. It's actually revolutionizing economics, but it hasn't really got very much to political economy, and even less to political economy of trade. So what we do is basically draw on loss aversion, which is part of the prospect theory, and that refers to people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gain. So it's more hurtful for you to lose $100 than to get $100, and usually losses loom larger than gains. And in the domain of loss, people are risk-seeking. Now, what is a loss, what is a gain, depends on a reference point, and oftentimes it's a status quo or some sort of entitlement you think you have. And what we think is going on is that there's like a double loss. The first one is the relative status of a country. If you're a hegemon and you might be losing that status, you might be in a loss frame and exhibit loss aversion. The second thing is, and Richard Baldwin yesterday mentioned it already, is the elephant curve by Milanovic. So there is an inequality issue for the middle classes of the rich world. And they think they are losing out, and it was also mentioned on the last panel. There is some sort of anxiety going on, uncertainty and anxiety that they're going to lose out. So we think there's a double loss frame here, which might explain what's going on. The second thing we are looking at is connected to what was already talked about yesterday, geoeconomics and security. Now, framing is also a deviation of the rational choice model because the rational choice model assumes that no matter how you frame a decision situation, if it's objectively the same, you should be taking the same decision. We do know this is not happening. A lot depends on framing. Now, we do also know that in security and conflict situations, people tend to be hawkish, and again, if they're in a loss frame, tend to make more risky choices. They also tend to exhibit an illusion of control, and that refers to what Trump has called trade wars are easy to win, which was also already mentioned on the last panel. We also look at motivational deviations from rational choice. We do know that fairness matters for people. But of course, whatever is fairness is also subject to so-called self-serving biases, right? So what's fair, you determine yourself. And so if you look at Trump tweets, he basically talks a lot about unfairness of trade agreements the US has concluded, and all sorts of measures other countries are taking in response, for example, on Harley-Davidson, the measures of the EU. The last thing we look at is the availability heuristic, and that's a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples that come to a given person's mind when evaluating a specific topic or decision. And it operates on the notion that if something can be recalled, it must be important. And people tend to heavily weigh their judgment toward more recent information and making new opinions biased towards the latest news. So what we did basically is a little bit to attempt to assess the availability of information on trade, China and trade war and protectionism related issues in the US society. So we look at possible sources of salience of these topics, and of course we have to use proxies. And this is what I would like to show you. If you look at the Trump tweets related to China and trade, this is basically what you see from 2012 to 2019. Trump retweets, because of course it needs to have a resonance, and what you see on the right-hand side is the liking things. So we also have some sort of issue. I'm done in a sec. The liking issue. So we look at trade and China and trade and stuff like that. We look at Google search volume, again on China and trade, picking up, so people are very interested in that. And in the relevance of the media, and we thought we'd take CNN as a more democratic outlet, Fox and MSNBC, and this is basically on trade, how important trade becomes, and then on security, where you also see like security is somehow ticking up a little bit, right? But in conjunction with trade, that would basically get you to hawkish biases. I stop here and leave the rest for the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. So again, there's a tremendous amount in this paper to help us think about the confluence between all of these motivators. And so I'm going to turn to Alan for a little bit of a comment from his very wise perspective at looking at this on sort of whether you would agree with what history tells us about whether to situate this current crisis. I've heard Alan speak on a number of occasions on whether or not this is a moment to ensure that no good crisis goes to waste. I mean, how do we take advantage of this moment, and whether we can use the disruption and the thinking that Anna has really presented about the greater motivation of not losing what you have, as well as the motivations about fairness, to foment positive change. Can we do that, Alan?
Thank you very much for including me in this panel and for the sponsors, the G2. I start from the point of my on-the-road salesmanship of that the multilateral trading system is a magnificent achievement of humankind. There was nothing like it prior to 72 years ago. It helped try to maintain peace, and it's been very successful, and the world economy has grown just under the WTO's time by world global GDP is up by 4 times. So it has a phenomenal record. That said, I think the 2 presentations we've just heard point to some imperfections and I'll add a third one to that. The people are imperfect. They are insecure. There's income inequality. And they blame it on trade because they are actually not going to throw away these. They don't blame technology. If most of the problem is technology, which, after all, there are no plastic, well, vinyl records are coming back, but not in huge quantities compared with the money that's being made here. No cameras, no alarm clocks, whole industries, music in a different form, whole industries being wiped out, and no one's going to say, that is terrible. Just give me a larger television screen at home and I'll be okay. So what do you blame? You blame trade, except the young don't. The Pew Research poll in the United States shows that young people are generally for free trade. And Bruce Stokes, who makes the presentation with respect to the Pew poll, says there's a solution. Since the over age 55 white males who have lost factory jobs are really a problem, the solution is that they must die. And I was asked, well, what happens if, as the younger generation gets older, they turn against trade? I'd say, well, we who have died will be very disappointed. So imperfection of sort of the people's view of what's happened to them, imperfection of governments who, Simon has pointed out, impose trade restrictions left and right and in the center. There's an imperfection, actually, although I don't use this in my remarks ever, I hope, imperfections in institutions. We're trying to govern something. What is governance? Governance has three functions. It has a legislative function. How well do we do on that? Not so well. You wouldn't grade it at sort of, we've had three very good agreements since the WTO came along: ITA expansion, the TFA, which is being implemented, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and expansion of the coverage of the Information Technology Agreement. So some things can be done, but not enough. The executive function, look for it. We can go into that later, but there isn't one. We have temporary chairs, very good ones. David Walker is chairman of the Dispute Settlement Body. What's his role? What exactly can he do as head of the Dispute Settlement Body? As facilitator, he can help solve the appellate body situation. As chair of the appellate body, he is solely part of the employment agency for the appellate body. They do nothing else. So ambassadors ceased to bother to come to those meetings unless there's some fireworks that are going to take place. But why listen to the winner saying we won and the loser saying we lost? So there is the executive function, monitoring, pointing out where the problems are, analysis. Do we ever analyze whether a bilateral trade agreement, so-called free trade agreement, is actually better for the world? No, we don't do that. Somebody else might, maybe at an academic institution. We do not. Does trade policy review ever have any impact on a major country? It does on lesser-sized countries, but the United States does not go away and say, we didn't know we had sugar quotas. We didn't know it cost our people a great deal, so we're going to maintain them. We didn't know we had a Jones Act in the United States, or whatever. All the imperfections that Simon points out, we do not do more than have some commentary. We have 2 days of meetings. It's very nice. Everybody goes away. If it's a large country, they have changed nothing whatsoever. So we do not have an executive function. And then I would say our fixation, I believe that there should be an appellate function. I think that's very important. But the jewel in the crown notion is distracting us from the fact that it's the crown that matters. The jewel itself doesn't do very much. if you don't have the crown. What's the crown? It is a multilateral trading system that actually functions, and we are deficient in the functioning of that system. So Smoot-Hawley, convenient reference point. We had a Great Depression. Doesn't matter whether trade did most of it or a minor part of it. It's simply the generation that lived through that said, we're not going to have that again, and part of it is we're going to have more open trade. And Roosevelt and Churchill, as part of their war aim, said we're going to have equal trade opportunities for all, and they constructed it. They and their successors constructed it in 1947 with Bretton Woods and with a multilateral trading system. And it helped maintain peace. And we'll get to China, but it does not, and the U.S. It does not guarantee peace, but it helps maintain it. So we have something of enormous value. There is rot, which Simon has pointed out. Part of the problem, I think, is the buffering mechanisms failed, and we can get into that in discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to now turn to this side of the table to think about some of the China issues. Again, many would lay the blame for the current state of affairs even here at the WTO, or certainly the state of affairs with respect to the idea of trade wars, at the feet of the struggle between the United States and China, with lots of allegations from the United States stemming from the basic claim that the U.S. and to some degree the rest of the WTO were, quote, promised that China would become more of a market economy at the time that China joined the WTO. And for the first few years, it may have looked as though that was happening, but it's clear that China has to some degree turned away from that path to some degree. And the complaints have also focused on much more specific issues, from the theft of intellectual property to forced transfer of technology to the use of subsidies for favored industries, which leads to overcapacity and overproduction, and on to the increase in the size, number, and power of state-owned enterprises. So if I turn to this side of the table, I'm going to start with Andrew, who's written, again, a very interesting paper in terms of how do we want to think about or address the diversity of economic models of members of the WTO. So, Andrew, I think for you, if the friction of today relates to the different economic and political models in China vis-a-vis the United States, how have such divergences been dealt with in the past? What's different now, and what can be done to ensure that the global economic order is equipped to address this diversity of economic models?
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for the question and for the introduction, and also thank you to the organisers of the conference. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Jennifer said at the opening of this panel, this opening bit of this panel is for us to introduce some of the papers that we have for a special issue on trade wars, and so let me do that. And of course, in later parts of the panel, we'll have other questions on the trade wars more generally. But my paper starts with what I think is a fairly common diagnosis of the problem, of the somewhat deeper problem underlying the current US-China tensions, which is the emergence of what's commonly called Sino-capitalism or Chinese state capitalism. So a different kind of market capitalism in China. And the paper starts by reframing the problem of Chinese state capitalism as part of a much larger and more general issue, which is the emergence of a wide range of new forms of market capitalism, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and the greater integration of those different kinds of market capitalism with the accompanying tensions. And so that reframing of the problem, essentially the argument is that coupled with some other matters I'll get to in a moment, has reopened a question of the legitimate range of institutional diversity between different kinds of market capitalism, which should be permitted in conditions of global market competition. And I argue in the paper, to start with, that finding an adequate response to that question is one of the core longer-term or medium-term challenges for the system. And finding an adequate way of responding to that question, an adequate legal technique, or finding a way of responding to it in a legal framework is a challenge for those who wish to maintain a multilateral rules-based order. So just to be clear, this is not a response to specific US-China frictions. It's not intended as a solution to those, of course. I have some ideas about those, which we will get to later on in the panel. But what it is saying is that there is in the background a larger and more systemic problem, and that if any compromise is to, if any new durable compromise is to emerge, we need some legal technique for resolving that problem. Okay. So then the paper goes on to say, this is not a new problem. Of course, this has emerged in the past. Everything from the European capitalisms of the post-war period, Latin American capitalisms, and then, of course, the emergence of East Asian capitalism in the 1970s. This is not a new problem. In the past, the GATT developed what I say a compromise to this problem, which has 4 elements. I won't go through all 4 of them, but just very briefly, formally speaking on the rules, a real freedom to adopt whatever system you wish. On the other hand, a variety of pressures towards marketization of a particular kind, particularly through accession negotiations and who one lets into the club. And here I'm going to give a shout out to Nicholas Lamp, who's written what I think is the best article on that dynamic of the club mechanism. Plus, and this is the crucial bit, certain mechanisms which are internal to the system to limit imports where institutional differences take on a certain character. And of course, I'm talking about trade defences here primarily, not exclusively, but primarily trade defences, anti-dumping and countervail, and safeguards to some extent. And it was John Jackson who said this first, and I'm going to read out. He says the trade defence mechanisms act as an interface or buffer mechanisms caused by interdependence among different economic systems. They can be a crude or blunt instrument to cause different economic systems to more equitably share the burdens of adjusting to shifts in world trade flow. Right. So this was his idea from from I think the 2nd edition of his book. And the point is, I suppose, is that now this range of techniques has, for a variety of different reasons, become less useful. There's certainly a perception that these trade defence mechanisms are either less available or less suitable to deal with this problem. Okay? So we need a set of techniques, this is just to repeat, for resolving this broader question. We need to renew some kind of these legal techniques we have. And then the paper, most of the paper is spent looking at one particular legal technique which has emerged, and that is the concept of market distortion. That's the concept which, in fact, I think is probably with us for some time, and so I think it's worth thinking about. And basically I argue that on the one hand, in my view, there are serious problems with the way it's currently being operationalized. I think its conceptual difficulties haven't yet been thought through, and so I try to explain what some of those are. I think it's very far from an ideal legal concept. On the other, I do make the case that I think it can be made to work with pragmatic and sensitive interpretations. And I try in the final bit of the paper, which you'll have to read the paper to find out. I'll give you, if you're interested, I'll tell you. But I make 5 suggestions about what that might look like. And at the core of them is making a distinction between market distortions and the institutional conditions within which markets operate. It also has a set of ideas about how to use the standard of review, about how to adopt an approach in certain circumstances based on Canada fit, how to use the adjustment of proxies in a better way, and so on. But the idea is that we can make this concept potentially work to deal with this much larger problem. It may well be that in the medium term, it may well be that just like in the 1970s and 80s, these larger general rules and legal techniques have to be coupled with bilateral and other measures of dubious legality, right, as a practical matter, but I think it's possible to do this at the multilateral level with a set of rules, and I think market distortion can do it in principle. So just to repeat, it's not as if obviously, it's not as if I'm offering a particular legal technique as a solution to the trade war. I'm trying to diagnose a larger problem underneath and saying having a legal technique to deal with that problem is a necessary, obviously not a sufficient condition, but a necessary condition to have a durable multilateral rules-based trading system going ahead.
Thank you, Andrew. And the last paper that I want to focus on really goes to one of the issues that has been at the core of at least the United States' complaint, which is really centered on intellectual property and then more specifically forced technology transfer. So to Julia, why? I mean, what's driving the concern? Is the United States right to complain about this? And what might be a better way to think about technology transfer regimes? So, Julia.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's really my privilege to be in this room to share the ideas of this paper. The U.S.-China trade war may be about many things, but I think it's ultimately about rivalry in technology. The issue of IP protection in China has been a perennial one, but the U.S. Has raised a different set of issues in this trade war, including the issue of forced technology transfer. So my paper actually aims at to explore the implications of the issue for international economic law in general. First of all, very quickly, it's not working? Okay, all right, it is. Okay. Some very quickly, background information. So the legal trigger of the current U.S.-China trade war was the Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974. The USTR Section 301 report issued last year made 4 key findings. One of them is forced technology transfer. And so of the 4 major findings, the United States filed a WTO complaint with respect to a national treatment violation under TRIPS. But for forced technology transfer and the other 2, cyber theft issue and the U.S. acquisition of U.S. companies with key technologies in the United States, the basis of these 3 findings, U.S. Started unilaterally impose import tariffs. So I'm not going to go through this. This is basically what the actions the 2 countries take against each other. So the point is Section 301 obviously are inconsistent with the key obligations of the WTO members, including in particular MFN, tariff bindings, and also DSU Article 23, which requires members to bring issues covered by WTO agreement to the multilateral dispute settlement process. So the U.S. claim is essentially the 3 types of three types of China practices are either beyond the coverage of WTO agreements or cannot be effectively regulated thereby. So in this context, I just wanted to highlight, actually, there is a China-specific obligation, which essentially says that China shall ensure that any means of approval for foreign investment in China will not be conditioned upon a bunch of performance requirements, including in particular transfer technology or conduct of research and development in China. So despite the fact there is a specific WTO obligation on China, the U.S. Did not bring any dispute settlement action based on this particular provision. All right. So despite this apparent inconsistency with the WTO the obligations, the U.S. Position essentially gotten the EU and Japan support. So the 3 countries on this particular issue has basically formed a united front. And they had a joint statement repeated again and again, and the EU concept paper on WTO modernization last September particularly mentioned the need to establish new rules to address market access barriers, including in particular forced technology transfer. And then 3 countries really confirmed their willingness and to do new law to enforce and then to make new rules in this area since then. So forced technology transfer has become an issue of systemic importance for the WTO regime. And it has potential impact on many other countries, especially developing countries. So here, just want to highlight the 3 major issues I'd like to address briefly within the limited available time. First, what is exactly forced technology transfer? Second, is there a problem with China's market for technology policy? which I chase as the root of the forced technology transfer problem. Third, how should forced technology transfer be regulated? So come down to first question. What exactly is forced technology transfer? It turns out it's very, very difficult to define. So far, there are different papers, and including one from OECD, and everybody recognizes how difficult it is to provide a precise legal definition of what it is. But without knowing what it is, it's very difficult to come up with new rules regulating the practice. So for the purpose of my paper, I just generally make forced technology transfer to cover any government requirement a foreign person share its proprietary information as a condition for doing business in the country. And in that very general category, I divided into two situations. One is this goal is implemented through administrative measures, explicitly or implicitly, which includes government approvals, any sort, licensing, permits, regulatory procedures such as antitrust, investigation, national security investigation. And the second category is through the policy the practice is carried out through foreign ownership restrictions, such as mandatory joint ventures or foreign direct investment prohibited sectors. The reason for this, the second category is when you have a mandatory joint venture, in order for the joint venture to operate as planned, you would need the technology necessary to enable that operation, and depending on the sector where the foreign ownership restrictions are imposed. And then in this category of defining what the forced technology transfer means, I think it's very important for people who are not necessarily understanding how the business is conducted to see that forced technology transfer does not mean free technology transfer in commercial transactions. Other than a separate situation I will mention below, the general idea is this. As far as China practice is concerned. I'm sorry. My time is up already? Okay, it's very hard to, it's very, sorry, it's just too much to talk about. So the commercial, essentially the forced technology transfer means the government will require foreign person to transfer technology, to share technology. Nonetheless, it's been paid for. If it's equity investment, it will be calculated as equity in a dollar amount. If it's licensing, there will be fees paid. All right. So here is actually a IMF data and showing that as of last year, 2 years ago, China actually is the number 4 in terms of the amount of licensing fees paid. I can see my time is up, and so maybe the remaining 3 questions can be discussed, and or like Andrew said, you just have to read my paper.
Exactly. And again, I'm only trying to protect time for everyone in the audience to have their opportunity to answer some questions. But I wanted to start with a couple of comments or questions here from the panel. And maybe I'm going to turn a little bit to this side of the room, but before I do that, I want to give Alan an opportunity to comment on sort of where do you see the U.S.-China disputes? Do Andrew's ideas about a more flexible approach that recognizes a diversity of economic models give you hope for a more multilateral solution? Could we imagine a system that Julia has proposed in which technology-related policy could be correlated to levels of development in different economies in order to think about technology being transferred to countries that need it for their development without creating unfairnesses to those that own technology? I mean, do you have a thought on how we think about the China-U.S. trade dispute in a WTO context?
A couple of comments. One is that if 2 countries choose to go to war, whether it is a trade war or it's a shooting war, there is no international agreement that will prevent that. However, can the WTO, which is, I guess, why we're sitting here, be of some utility in managing the problems? I think that I don't know whether I think the convergence is not so much going to be between the two sides initially as between whether the rules of the WTO can converge with the current problem of the competition between the two countries. Most of my career was spent on Japan. It took 30 years. I didn't spend all of that time. The governments kept changing, of conversation, and there was convergence. The solution was convergence. The second example would be USSR, and the solution was the disappearance of the USSR. Their system collapsed. That is not what's happening with respect to China. Maybe slowing a bit, but it is not collapsing. But are there areas of potential convergence, whether they're here or elsewhere? And I think there are. It may be, in a nuclear age between the U.S. and the USSR, there were things that each side agreed they would not do to the other. It was, or at least tacitly agreed, mutually assured destruction. Bringing down through cybersecurity the electrical grid of the United States by China, or vice versa, the electrical grid in China by the United States, might be something that at some point the two combatants might agree to. Does it have a role here? I don't know. There are areas where we could cooperate. I say we, they, the U.S. and China. In this room, I spent the last 2 days here on the DDGs don't, Deputy Directors General don't chair anything with one exception. On behalf of the Director General, I chaired the Cotton Development Assistance Forum, and China was sitting there, and the EU was sitting there, and the United States was sitting there. And where is their convergence? They all want to help largely the West African countries that are least developed, extremely poor, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and one other. I can always name 3 out of 4. Benin. They don't do very well at growing cotton, and they really desperately need help. So we had one day on helping them with cotton byproducts, oil and seed and what have you. China and the United States are both helping them, as well as Pakistan and India. So on development, where actually the two sides are divided in terms of their approach to development, China says, developing countries, we side with them. Let's agree on special and differential treatment up front before we agree to anything else. The United States says, first, let's see what we can agree to as a pragmatic matter, and then we'll decide what the capability, the capacity of those countries are. There may be a middle ground in there. So there are things that the two sides can agree on that would be convergence. I do not easily see coexistence in the way framed in the two papers as easily fitting within this organization. Maybe I'm short-sighted in that respect, but if the Chinese economy is going to maintain its current direction, that will pose difficulties. I don't know how we manage forced technology transfer. To me, it's a bit like the underreporting of spousal abuse. Countries, as the paper pointed out, companies, excuse me, when they invest, they say, we can make a profit, and the Chinese authorities say, well, we'll give you the free land, and we'll give you the permit to build the building, but you're going to put your latest product here, your latest technology will be here, and we'll learn from it, right? So that's technology transfer. Was it forced? Not at all clear. So I think that the trilateral so-called effort, which is the U.S., EU, and Japan that was alluded to in the prior panel, that has said that they want to talk about how state-owned enterprises compete, which means also when they buy as well as when they sell, that address transparency, that address industrial subsidies, if they ever get to that point. there will be some additional potential for the WTO to provide some buffering mechanisms between systems that are colliding and are not evolving closer together in all respects. There are some divisions that remain.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to turn to a couple of quick questions and ask one or two of our, or three of our panelists to just give a quick response. And I'm going to start with the issue of retaliatory tariffs. I mean, as you know, in response to the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, 9 countries filed challenges at the WTO, while 6 countries imposed their own immediate tariffs in response, most generally arguing that the U.S. tariffs looked like and acted like safeguards. So these countries were justified in using provisions in the WTO Safeguards Agreement to immediately impose their own tariffs on U.S. exports in response. So my question to at least a couple of you is, was their response the right thing to do? And if not, what should those countries have done instead? And more broadly, what should the WTO and the world, if you will, be doing to respond to unilateral tariffs? And I'm only going to mention just a comment on a New York Times editorial that appeared Wednesday by very prominent U.S. economist Paul Krugman, entitled "Tariff Isn't a Beautiful Word." So again, to be very clear, tariff is not a beautiful word. And he's commenting and he says, so am I saying that Trump is repeating the policy errors America made a century ago? No, he says, this time it's much worse. And he goes back to the 1920s and he says, after all, while Warren Harding, who was the president of the United States in the early 1920s, wasn't a very good president, he didn't routinely abrogate international agreements in a fit of pique. While America in the 1920s helped to build international institutions, it didn't do a Trump and actively try to undermine them. And while U.S. leaders between the wars may have turned a blind eye to the rise of racist dictatorships, they generally didn't praise those dictatorships and compare them favorably to democratic regimes. There are, however, enough parallels between U.S. tariff policy in the 1920s and Trumpism today for us to have a pretty good picture of what happens when politicians think that tariffs are beautiful. And it's ugly, is how it ends. So again, my question is, what should the WTO and what should these other countries have done in response to these unilateral tariffs by the United States on steel and aluminum? Maybe, Simon, I could start with you.
Maybe this is a very naive answer, but the economist in me says nothing. Nothing. Because Joan Robinson put this perfectly. Just because some idiot throws rocks into their own harbor doesn't mean that you should throw rocks into yours. And there is something to this argument. Why inflict pain on yourself? Because some idiot has been inflicting pain on their own themselves too. So in fact, therefore, what I'm trying to make the case is there might actually be a case for defiance, just taking the hit and not hitting back.
I guess I can just say something just in the interests of getting a conversation going, but it seems to me that they did the only thing they could do, actually. So in terms of the immediate response, I think it has a plausible legal justification on that side, but also, at a more general perspective, when one has a multilateral agreement, a cooperative game, and you have a defector, the response is to demonstrate to the defector who no longer believes it's in that defector's interest to play the game, why in fact it is in the interests of that defector to play the game. And so it has some demonstration effect. Also, domestically, I don't think it'll work. If the perception is that the WTO regime means sitting and waiting 3 years for a remedy for this, which may or may not be of any use when it comes, then I think one would lose support for the regime domestically as well. So I'm not sure that there was any alternative. And I would say it didn't necessarily. There is, as I say, a plausible legal justification, perhaps even more than that, which was important too.
Anne?
Thank you, Jennifer. I think Simon is right on the purely economic account, because you heard yourself if you impose tariffs. But on a political economy basis, I guess it's more difficult, or on a psychological basis. Legally, it's also pretty clear. But what I found interesting is that in the beginning, basically states tried to say, well, we want to talk. We want to talk. We are not immediately retaliating. We want to talk. We want to find a consensus. So it's all, they were all trying to uphold cooperation. Whereas the US, so conditionally cooperating, I think this is what the signal is. If you somehow cooperate with us, we cooperate with you, and we do not retaliate immediately. It's not tit for tat. It's tit for two tats. This is what we are doing. Now this is the most successful strategy, game theoretically speaking, to uphold cooperation, and you're actually the winner of the game. Right? What I'm concerned about, and I think, Simon, you have talked to that before, and I love your term because you used it 10 years ago already, is this murky protectionism. Right? Murky protectionism wasn't nice. But what's happening now is open protectionism, and the frame is changing. The frame is changing from cooperation to competition. It's changed to relative gains. We want relative gains, and that matters. This framing matters in the future of the international cooperation on economic matters. Okay? So this is why I think at least the EU reaction, this tit for two tats, was the right thing to do. We can't just sit back, because some sort of sanctions you need, again, game theoretically speaking, how and under what circumstances do actors cooperate. Okay? I hope I made myself clear.
Yes, I actually like this topic very much. Unlike the Section 232, the retaliation, at least the U.S. tariff and the EU and other countries' reaction were supposedly within the legal framework, under safeguards or agreement and so forth. But if you look at it, U.S.-China, the retaliation taken by China, there is no pretense or something. You just cover its retaliation, and it's just escalated out of control. So from the very beginning, I just felt Article 23 of DSU actually provides the legal obligation for you to take, not to retaliate, but to take the disputes. Other parties very aggressive action or are in violation of rules, instead of doing unilaterally or bilaterally, Article 23 of DSU provides a protection for WTO members to seek dispute settlement at the WTO through a multilateral mechanism rather than doing it on your own. What is the wisdom of it? I don't know how it was negotiated originally, whether there were some kind of economic rationale behind it. But since trade war is your self-inflicting pains, why not use this to protect yourself? Meanwhile, enhance the multilateral institution, the multilateralism, the legalism of all these nice things, rule of law, enhance that. So from the very beginning, at the private level, I always felt the China's move was not a wise one. But obviously, most of the Chinese WTO scholars did not think that way. I think that they spent pretty much energy last year trying to figure out what exactly is the legal justification for China's retaliation, going outside the WTO law to public and national law. But so far, I have not seen any very convincing argument.
If I'm going to move away from the tariff issues and on to more on the, I apologize, Alan, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just, I wouldn't comment on the legality of any of the actions taken, but I was first chair of the OECD Steel Committee, which was formed with the idea that if there was information shared on investments that were being made in steel, that there would be more rational investments. And that didn't work. I mean, that was 3 decades ago or so, 4, I guess, to be more accurate. It didn't have the desired effect. To take that and load it onto dispute settlement is going, one talks about overloading a system that's already in deep trouble, is troubling it in itself. I just say on industrial subsidies, which is a very difficult issue, Boeing Airbus has been going on for 15 or 16 years, whatever it's been. What if you take manufacturing 2025 and you say, okay, there are 10 industries, let's just have 10 more Boeing Airbus disputes brought into the WTO about the subsidies that are being put into that area. The fact is we've fallen down on rulemaking. We've fallen back down on compromise. We're not managing, and we're trying to load everything into dispute settlement, and it can't sustain that burden.
I am going to move away from tariffs just for a minute and just ask, the U.S.-China trade war, if you will, may have started as a tariff war, but it has quickly evolved into a technology war. Certainly within the last few weeks with the U.S. sanctions on Huawei and possibly other Chinese high-tech firms. And to many, the tech war, as it's being called, may well be more consequential than the tariff war. As The Economist put it, this escalation makes this look more like a new kind of Cold War. Not to mention, sort of on the side, the human rights concerns in terms of China's treatment of the Uyghurs, the Muslim population in China. In short, it appears to many that the U.S.-China conflict appears to become more ideology-based rather than economic or trade-based, beyond the clashes between just different economic systems. If that is the situation, could the WTO have a role in managing the conflict, and if so, what role?
So the question has to do with the nature of the inflection point in the international economic order and how it relates to the tech war, I guess. And I do have a particular reading on what is happening now. In terms of the inflection point in the international economic order. And it's simply this, that actually what we're seeing is, particularly in the US-China tensions, an attempt by one state, both states, to rewrite the rules of global trade in response to an emerging new international division of comparative advantage, a new global economy with new sectors, to secure their preferred places in that order. It's as simple as that. And that, in other words, it's a rewriting of the rules of the game, which although I have not that different an outlook from Alan, actually it's a different read from what you were talking about, Alan, because it suggests that there is the possibility that the ultimate endgame could be a new set of rules for a different global division of labour and a new global, in new context of global comparative advantage. Everything depends on the deal that can be struck. I mean, it's a different read from saying this is about the disintegration of open trade, a turning away from liberal trade generally. It's a different read from saying what's driving all of this is the social dislocation caused by economic globalization. What it's saying is there's an understanding that the rules of the game play a huge role in helping to establishing positions in global comparative advantage, and there's an attempt to rewrite those rules of the game. And that may or may not be successful. But for me, that makes sense of the linking in of the tech war with the trade war and so on.
Yeah, just very quickly, what I feel is, first of all, I mean, if we go to a tech war, we target businesses, single businesses, which is highly dangerous, right? Because before it was an issue on the international plane. Now, if you do this and you label a firm as a security risk, I mean, you can regulate like the UK did, or you can just put it out as a security risk, and basically what you target is consumers. And then we are in the field of consumer boycotts. And this, of course, can happen then, including in China, on any firm operating in China, because people will just not go and buy any US products anymore, or whatever country is targeted. So here I think we cannot maneuver it anymore at one point. I find this highly dangerous. And I don't know, how far the responsibility of the government will go, but I mean, you all remember China, Korea. the boycott of Korean products. We are not grappling with this within the WTO, really, and the question is whether we should. Or what's the responsibility of governments on those issues? Because in the moment, they are bringing it up on themselves.
Yes, I think that I'd like to probably focusing on the possible role of the WTO, as Jennifer pointed out. I think that on the rulemaking side, we obviously do not have sufficient rules with respect to digital trade. This is the one area, the reason why Huawei has been a target is really because Huawei has gotten into very, very forefront of the digital economy. And its technology is supposedly, if it's not the top, among the top companies in the world. So this is an issue that obviously the rulemaking is not easy. And obviously on the rulemaking side, it's the scope of national security in the digital world. That's probably a long shot. But I think another thing that's maybe it's too late right now. However, I think that WTO dispute settlement mechanism has been underutilized in terms of the relating to the technology and the national security area, not national security per se. But here's what I thought. The WTO remains still the only international institution where China has accepted state-to-state mandatory adjudication. And China has been highly responsive to the adverse rulings of the WTO dispute settlement body, right? That is on the record. And the reason why I'm saying that it's not been fully utilized to do something about China's technology or to accuse all these national security intelligence or these issues has so much to do with lack of internet freedom inside China. Ideologically, that has become the reason why you have the threat of the Cold War 2.0 based on this. So years ago, I think about 10 years ago, when Google was first kicked out or left China, and there was a period of time, a lot of scholars and industries actually contemplated on bringing a big WTO case complaint against China because the internet restriction in China, running from banning Google, Facebook, YouTube, Dropbox, you name it, and all the news outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, and the Bloomberg Business News, and The Economist, and Financial Times, you name it. All of that obviously affect businesses. And so there is, I think, a quite legitimate claim under the GATS that China may have violated some of its obligations. That even if there is a case brought and then China somehow does not lose on those claims, it would put the issues in front of the world. And then we can probably debate and think about these issues. I think that would have somehow ameliorate the current, at least from ideological standpoint, the confrontation, to see this as an irreconcilable fight. But maybe it's too late already.
So now is the time I'd like to open it up to everyone in the room. And again, just a tiny reminder that this panel was both to focus our discussions and close out, but also to let you know about this upcoming edition of the Journal of International Economic Law, again, focusing on this wise consequences and solutions to the trade war. So I'm going to invite not only questions, but again, for the four scholars that opened up a brief mini presentation of their papers, I want to also invite your comments, your criticisms, your feedback that they could take on board. So I'm going to start, and I may take 4 or 5 comments, and if you're directed to one person in particular, that might be helpful. But I'm going to open it up, and I see I'm going to start with Ulrich.
Thank you very much for a splendid discussion. I have a question for Andrew and for Julia. Jennifer, if your interpretation of the American trade policy is correct, that the blocking of the appellate body aims at going back to the old GATT dispute settlement system, then it is very likely that none of these 10 pending panel disputes challenging the US import restrictions will ever be adopted. None of them will be adopted. So next year, I mean, if this happens, then, I mean, Russia and China will certainly start imitating the US behavior and just ignore WTO rules. Andrew's proposal to follow the European example, what we call ordoliberalism in Europe, to negotiate rules limiting market distortions, competition rules, state trading rules, subsidy rules, transparency rules, all that, that cannot happen in this institution. That is very clear. So we need a new world trading system, we need a new WTO. And my question then is to Andrew and to Julia, is it not naive to believe that the WTO will remain the central place? I mean, is it not much more reasonable, I don't use the term rational, but is it not only much more reasonable for China as the emerging world power #1 to continue what it is doing now, that is to conclude this alliance with Russia, securing access to primary resources, its OBOR, One Belt, One Road strategy, 70 agreements with WTO members on bilateral infrastructure centering on a global division of labor, focusing on China. So is it not much more reasonable for China to design a new world trading system by further developing this OBOR initiative, this alliance with Russia, and not inviting a discussion on state trading enterprises here? China will not give up its model. So isn't it inevitable that the WTO will more or less become marginal in the next 2-3 years?
Kathleen.
Thanks so much to all of you for the wonderful comments. I'd like to ask a question that's a variation on something that a number of you touched upon, but Julia almost squarely touched upon, but just to invite any of you to comment. And I apologize, it's a question that some of you have heard me pose before in a couple different writings. It's clear that the topics of forced technology transfer and theft of trade secrets by China was addressed in the Obama administration as well, and they were working on that for some time. And I suspect that perhaps part of the reason that never materialized into a WTO case was because of the evidentiary challenges of proving that at the WTO. So my question is, and that's even if we accept that there are WTO rules that cover it, which I think we could debate further. So what is a WTO member to do when facing a practice by another WTO member that they feel like cannot actually prove through WTO dispute settlement?
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question will be to Andrew as well, and I actually agree with my colleague that with respect to the concept of market distortions, don't you think that recent anti-dumping agreement does not have basis, and the text of the anti-dumping agreement does not have basis for the market distortions as such? It's second question. First question. Second, taking this into account, don't you think that the panels and the appellate body cannot solve this problem, as recommendations and rules cannot add or diminish rights and obligations of the covered agreement? And last, as the concept of market distortions was not at the table when the WTO agreement was concluded in 1994, doesn't that mean that if we put this concept now, that means that other members that did not take this into account when they concluded the WTO agreement in 1994 or acceded to the WTO afterwards will think that this balance will be changed, and that will be changed their behavior on the compliance on the WTO obligations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Wallace Chen from German Development Institute. As economists, I think we all agree that technology dissemination is critical for development. It's critical for SDGs, including climate change. My question is that if we try to have a new rule makings in WTO, should we not only address the state intervention in terms of importing technology, but also to address the state intervention for not transfer technology to developing countries? I just repeated my question. Maybe Alan could, I would like Alan to comment on that. Should the new rule of WTO to address not only the forced technology transfer into your country, but also prohibit technology going out of your country? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to comment on Andrew's point on rewriting the rules, which I think Julia and the others have touched upon. I was puzzled by this because I saw that the rules have already been rewritten when China joined the WTO 18 years ago. And I think now is more like a situation of unforeseen development where we have seen that since in China has taken a different turn than that was expected when it joined the WTO, because when it joined the WTO was like a secret word in China. You know, everybody was studying WTO. There was so much enthusiasm for the WTO, embracing the principles embodied in the WTO. But nowadays, things have changed, especially over the last past 5 or 6 years. So I think the problem is really not just with regard to China alone, because changes in China, I mean, you could say there are internal reasons, but there are external reasons. So we, rather than just trying to rewrite the rules for China, which was already rewritten 18 years ago, maybe, you know, we have to think of reviving something else which started 18 years ago, that was the Doha round, because part of the problem is that the Doha round couldn't conclude. And I personally would prefer the option where we change the rules on the whole for the WTO members as a whole, rather than just for one single country. Because the risk of doing this just for one country is that what if one day, you know, another country, you know, just feels unhappy and they decide to change the rules. And we all know what this other country might be. So I want to get your reactions on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start with Andrew and then ask the other panelists to comment on any of the questions that you heard, with the idea that we are going to try to finish by 1:15.
Thank you. Thank you for wonderful questions. Perhaps I can probably take most of them in a group, actually. To some extent, they cover the same ground. So the first two questions had to do with the centrality of the WTO, and I guess I have a narrow and a broad response to that. The narrow response, which is going to sound like a cop-out, but it's actually not, and I'll try and explain why, is that the paper is arguing that if we want to save or return to a multilateral trading system, then we need to have thought about the legal techniques which are going to solve this problem, which will be an enduring problem, right? So in a sense, it's just an if-then. But at the same time, I do think that to some extent, having a toolkit of workable legal techniques is actually a really important thing to have if that's our aspiration. So it's not just a side question. But secondly, the broader answer to your question, which has to do with, well, your read of China's interests, for example, and so on. I don't know whether to characterize myself as optimistic or pessimistic. I see China's interests pointing in two different directions. I know, Julia, you've talked about China being very comfortable with a bilateralism. I see China at the moment trying to position itself as a very strong advocate for a multilateral system, positioning itself as one of the original founders, not so much obviously of the trade system, although even there, but of the general liberal international economic order after World War II. I think we're in for an enduring period of uncertainty where, yes, of course, the WTO will continue and do lots of work, but be much less central than it was. But because I read this situation in the way that I do, that it is an attempt to rewrite the global rules, then I do see a real prospect down the line of a rewritten set of global rules. In other words, it's something like what we saw in the 70s and 80s, right, in which the creation of the WTO was absolutely, the preconditions for it were set by aggressive unilateralism of the US in the 70s and 80s. So that's where this read comes from. So just very quickly on market distortions, perhaps we can have a discussion about the technicalities. Obviously, in the anti-dumping agreement, it's on much less secure ground. Subsidies agreement, you've actually got quite an entrenched notion of market distortion within the benefit analysis and the market benchmarking. That seems to me to, well, so we can have a discussion about that, but that seems to be at least more secure than the anti-dumping agreement. You argued, and again, I'll be as brief as I can. You argued that the inclusion of a notion of market distortion there would change the balance of the agreement because the negotiators didn't. To some extent, that's right. I sort of see it playing out in a different way. I'm not sure that this has been fully thought through. No doubt it has in some places. But I certainly see it working in another direction. Of course, those countries which are targeted by these measures and which are currently treated as distorted, of course they will do the opposite in return. Of course it's a relatively simple argument to make that the central economies are distorted in this way and this way and this way. And of course that will happen. And then that will lead to its own dynamics. So I see it playing out in a slightly different way. But I guess the simple, but I think the side issue, but I still think an important issue, is just to think about whether it still can be a practical, workable legal concept. And after much umming and ahhing, I think it has real problems, but I think it's possibly workable. Yeah.
So perhaps I can just say three things. I mean, I understand that the question is, I guess, implying that it might not be there'll be an absence of enough evidence about corporates who've faced trouble with technology transfer, and I must say, unless one has some type of register for this, I don't know how we solve this problem. My reaction to that ultimately is to say, well, that's actually not really a judiciable problem, then, is it? Right? And there was a time about 25 years ago where analysts on the WTO actually asked the question: is something essentially judiciable? But since, the last 20 years, it's all been about pushing the boundaries of the system. People stopped asking that question, and maybe they should start asking it again. Second point, we do have a huge problem in documenting policies. And this, I think, speaks to the point, one of the executive functions that Alan has highlighted. I mean, this is really broken down here. The fact that many G20 countries will not supply information on their subsidies measures to the WTO Secretariat is appalling, right? And I think this is something which should be roundly condemned. And so I think I would worry about that as well. And then there's a third, if I may just say, Jennifer, a third evidence problem, and it builds a bridge to Andrew's work, and that is that if we're going to talk about a systems clash, we need to persuade ourselves that the different systems are actually generating large cross-border adverse spillovers. We have to actually show this. Now, last year, and so I'll just give you one example for just 1 minute. Last year, I looked into the question about whether excess steel capacity in China was quite the problem that everyone says it is. And there are very few foreign governments who are willing to spill out any serious theory of harm as to how excess capacity might harm their interests. And the ones who do, when you go and check the underlying data about the strength of those knock-on effects, it's not just that one or two links in the argument break down empirically, they all do. And so you have to wonder if some of these systems clash questions could really be, or should be thought of after we have convinced ourselves that there is a first-order adverse cross-border spillover. And maybe that is a test that we should impose. And it is an empirical test. It's not a legal test, but this is an area where I think economics can offer something to the law, to the legal discussions as well.
Yeah, just very briefly on Catherine's question on the evidence. As I understand it, the evidentiary issue probably come down to attribution. How do you attribute the behavior of the SOEs or joint venture Chinese parties to the state? I think were at least in the GATT era, there were some cases relating to Japan. It could be utilized. The point is 2 points. One is actually the EU was brave enough, at least in January 2019, modified its original complaint on China technology transfer. They they explicitly included several claims based on the China accession protocol specific obligations on technology transfer, although most of those seem to be as such basis and looking at some of the old regulations. Nonetheless, it's a good start. And the second point is, unless we try, we wouldn't know where the case law will evolve. So I think it's similar to the question I raised earlier about bringing a big case, internet freedom case on China. It's the same thing. Unless some countries are willing to try it, we wouldn't know where the problem is. That's my response. On the question of whether it would be naive for China not to pursue the bilateral approach, I think that it's true that I feel traditionally China is very comfortable with bilateral approach in international relations. But economically speaking, right now, China has been the biggest beneficiary of the multilateral trading system, economic system. And the China economy has been so integrated with the rest of the world. So it's the real interest that drives China, at least at this moment, to advocate the multilateral system. It's in their real interest to do so. The recent tech war, or the threat of cutting off Huawei, which is like the star of China technology, I think amply demonstrates to the Chinese how important it is for China to still demonstrate how much reliant China is on outside technologies and so forth. It cannot be easily done, rely on itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I would like to address 2 points actually, and one is actually a follow-up on Andrew, and so I recommend you to read his paper. I think what is very important here is that, of course, there are varieties of capitalism, right? So the US capitalism has never been like the Swedish capitalism. There's so many different forms. There's a lot of economic writing about it. So the question really is, everybody distorts markets because markets are institutionally embedded. So what exactly is a distortion? So what we need to find is a theory probably first, and also negotiate on the question where exactly is the delineation on market distortions which matter on the international plane and which do not. And you can say, well, we have that because we have that already in the WTO. We know what exactly we care about, but if you dig deeper, we do not know. But just to make sure, beware about the term market distortions. There is no market which is not distorted in one or the other way because law is there. The second thing I would like to say is on the evidence. Very clearly, and again, economists have written a lot about it in contract theory, you need to be able to observe and you need to be able to verify the information before a court. And if you cannot do that, then you're basically out of third-party adjudication. Now, the question is, what mechanisms can we use to observe and to verify information on trade policies or subsidies, for example? And when I look up the street here, this is not a new problem in international relations. Look at the poor guys on all the human rights treaty bodies. They didn't get anything. They got them 8 years late from the states. And what did they do? They said, well, we turned to non-state actors. One is here, Simon Evanet, right, trying to collect. But there are, of course, other non-state actors from whom information can be collected. And that puts pressure on states. And this is what you have seen happening in the human rights treaty bodies. Okay? So that might be one idea in which we would like to think. And really, the third thing I just really want to stress, so much depends on the frame we are in. And I feel, when I hear discussions between China, the US, the EU, we are getting in a frame of mind which is deeply unhealthy, because we don't trust each other anymore. We don't trust that the other party wants to cooperate, and that makes or breaks us. And we had that historically seen. And the outcome wasn't good in 2 cases, right? We don't want to see that again. So I feel it's very difficult to get this ghost back in the bottle. I don't know how we are going to do it. I can just try to say, keep talking and try not to mistrust too much. I think that's where I want to end.
I'm going to give, of those on the panel, I'm going to give Alan the last word before we close out.
Thank you very much. It's been, the papers are very informative, and I've benefited from the discussion. I have not seen any evidence that China and Russia are trying to design some different system than the one that exists now. In fact, China has spoken, and the Russians as well, very much in favor of the multilateral trading system. Market distortions are on a continuum. In the case of Motorola was selling pagers to NTT in the era when there were pagers, maybe they still are, and they said, they finally got into the NTT market and they said, well, we want to lower our price because we want to sell you more. And they said, you don't understand. You have 1/6 of the purchasers, and that's it. So you can't lower your price. We don't want you to lower your price. You're not going to sell anymore. In China, in around 2010, the purchases from India, Denmark, and the United States of wind turbines dropped from a 77% market share to a 10% market share in 1 year. Why was that? The Chinese might have developed capacity and could undersell the foreigners, or something else was going on. You cannot tell because it's actually the bidding process is a state secret. But as I say, there's a continuum of market distortions and what's tolerable and what isn't. And the WTO tried to have, with anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards, some degree of interface mechanisms that John Jackson talked about. Export controls, which was raised and aimed at me. I've certainly heard about export controls from Chinese audiences. If it's really a question of national security, those cases are very delicate for our system. If you want to enter into a minefield, then you actually want to do a lot of litigation on what national security is, because every country has some interest that they consider national security. If Ambassador Deepak was here, he might be talking about public stockholding and food supplies, because that's national security. So we need to feed our people. Number one objective is to keep our people fed. So is a panel going to decide the size of public stockholding for India of grain? That might be a very dangerous thing to do for the system. The person who said change the rules for all, I don't think that that's a re-embrace of the Doha agenda, which is very divisive, taken as a whole. But if there were an understanding on industrial subsidies developed by some of the major players, including China, then why does it just apply to China and the major players? One would think that it should be a rule for all. So I agree with the thrust of that question. I think there will be areas of potential convergence. In other words, potential areas where there can be agreement that have to be worked out. I focus, because of the more than just the last 2 days, on on Africa. Africa is forming a customs union. what could we do to make that a success? How could we help them? They have intra-African trade of like 10%. It's very low compared with any place else on the planet. The agreement, I am told, is, I haven't read it, is still to be filled in on substance. Can we be of some, can all of us in the WTO members, be of some assistance in trying to make a success of that? And I just end on the point that 22 countries are at the door trying to get into the WTO. 36 came in since the WTO was founded, including China. In many cases, they come in for the same reason that the GATT was founded in the first place, which was to maintain peace, to help stabilize countries, to get a better shot at peace. Timor-Leste, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, the last two in were Liberia and Afghanistan. They want to be integrated into the world economy to have a better shot at peace. China and the United States and the EU and others collaborate to try to bring them along into the system because they have a common interest in promoting peace. So it's not all conflict, in fact. And I think that's as good a note to end on for me as any. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's now really my task to conclude this conference, this annual G2 conference. And let me do that by first expressing my huge thanks to Teresa Carpenter, to Maria Sarmiento, to Angelica Zaninelli at the Graduate Institute for all of their work on the organization and the logistics of this conference, and also to Christine Washington at Georgetown Law for her dedicated assistance as well. And I'd like to express my thanks and my congratulations to Joost Pauwelen from the Graduate Institute and to Chris Brummer from Georgetown Law for being our fearless leaders and for bringing these two institutions together for this conference. I'd also like to tell you that we intend to continue to hold this conference, so we would very much welcome your feedback on what you thought went well, what you think we should skip next time around, and or suggestions for how we might organize it. I'd third like to remind you to be on the lookout for this special edition of the Journal of International Economic Law. We do think it is the right time to dedicate an edition to this issue of, are we at a state of trade war? How did we get here? What are the consequences? And what are the solutions? So I urge you to look for that, and again, to give feedback to those that have done so. And finally, I want to close by saying, to the extent that any of you are feeling a little bit of pessimism about where the trading system might be headed, I, in the strongest terms, recommend that you come back to this room at 2 o'clock and watch the final round of the Jackson Moot Court competition, because I guarantee you that you will be inspired and awed by the level of talent, the level of dedication, and the level of support and articulation by the students that you will hear. Again, many teams from around the world have competed. It has now come down to the final two teams, the best two teams in the world that will be showcasing their talents in this room at 2 o'clock, debating an extremely complicated and difficult problem of WTO law. And so I do encourage you to come as a way of showing your support for these students that are going to be the leaders of the trading system in the next generation going forward. And with that, I would simply close out by saying thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your attendance. Again, thank you very much to my panelists, and to now invite you to lunch in the room across the way, and to then encourage you to come back here at 2 o'clock for the Jackson Moot Finals. Thank you very much, and thank you to my panelists.